Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Thanks for joining us today. On today's programme, I have the pleasure of speaking with a member of Barack Obama's cabinet, the US Trade Representative, Ambassador Ron Kirk, who joins us from the OECD here in Paris. Thanks very much for joining us, Ambassador, today. I'd like to go back to your nomination a couple of years ago to the post that you occupy today. You're seen very much as a champion of free trade. There were those that wondered whether a champion of free trade was the right man for the job.
Well, first of all, Melissa, thank you so much for having me on your program. And I guess if I look back on it, the most important thing is that President Obama thought I was the right person for the job. And I was both flattered and humbled by him asking me to join the cabinet. And I was willing to take on a portfolio that many thought would be one of the more challenging in an Obama administration, principally because I had the opportunity to work for a president that rejects false choices. And there was a growing narrative in the United States that we either had to blindly sort of follow this path of all trade is good, or on the other hand, we had to listen to those voices that said, oh, trade's awful, it's ruined our economy, let's withdraw. And our president, I think, was a little bit ahead of the times in understanding that Americans really did understand the power of trade, but they wanted a more balanced approach to it, and one that combined enforcement of our rights, but also making sure that our manufacturers and workers and ranchers had the level playing field that you've heard so many people, not just in America, but around the world, express.
There was that question. We've seen a number of things that had been considered rules, dogmas over the last few years, challenged, questioned, among them free trade. We've seen protests around the world. We've seen some of the weaker members of the international community suggesting that perhaps free trade isn't always the answer and that sometimes protectionism is a better approach for them. Do you remain committed to the principle of free trade?
Yeah, absolutely so, Melissa. And it's interesting that you would raise those particular points about people being willing to gamble on protectionism as a way to perhaps, I think, an expression of their belief it was a better way to create economic certainty and jobs. Because you mentioned I'm here in Paris for the OECD, and we began our conference by releasing a study that OECD had done in concert with the World Trade Organization, and more critically, the International Labor Organization and others. It's called ICITE, I-C-I-T-E, for any of your viewers, but it really examined the relationship between trade and economic growth and jobs and a number of other factors. And I think what it conclusively establishes is that those economies that embrace trade but also understand you have to couple an aggressive trade policy with investing in your people, particularly in education, and making sure you have a safety net for those harmed by trade. But those that embrace that in those economies explosively have grown and produced more jobs than those economies that have resorted to protectionism. And contrary to people's maybe intuitive instincts that protectionism is a better path to go, this study also demonstrates that protectionism, in fact, tends to operate against economic growth and job creation.
I'd like to look at a couple of key areas that you've worked on since you've taken up the job. We'll move on to the Trans-Pacific Partnership in a moment. I'd like to begin, though, with the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. This is, of course, a multinational treaty that critics say, well, its aim, supporters, is to enforce intellectual property rights. Its critics, though, say that it represents a threat to freedom of speech, and that its process has been secretive, and that although signed by a number of different countries, and yet to be enforced really or ratified, that it will represent a threat to freedom of the internet, for instance, to freedom of speech, and that people haven't been consulted enough on what the implications of such a treaty would be.
Well, the first thing I would invite any of your viewers to do, and I hope this doesn't come across as pejorative, but please take the time and read what we've actually done, because ACTA is based on one principle. For advanced economies like France, like many of those in the European Union, certainly in the United States, innovation is the lifeblood and the future of our economic destiny. And in areas like ours, in which the most pressing challenge facing those of us in government and concerns of your viewers, where are the next generation of jobs going to come from? And they're going to come from the fact that we are knowledge-based, innovative economies that will absolutely evaporate if we allow rampant commercial scale counterfeiting and pirated goods to rob the fruits of that innovation. And all the ACTA agreement seeks to do is take principles already embodied, established in U.S. law, in France, in Germany, throughout the EU, Australia, Japan, the rest of us that signed it, and said collectively we can do a better job combating counterfeiting and piracy than we can alone. And ACTA, I want to say this because it's important. ACTA is the only agreement that explicitly states in the agreement that we recognize internet freedom. It does nothing to restrict internet freedom or data flows or any of those other issues around piracy. It only gives our governments more tools to make sure that copyright and intellectual property rights are not just a paper promise, that we actually have the ability to enforce them.
This is a debate that reflects one we've had a great deal in France because of legislation introduced by Nicolas Sarkozy. And whilst that side of the argument is clear, the other is that you would be creating a body, in this case an international one, whose job it would be to check what people are looking at on the internet and, where necessary, to prevent people from being on it.
Nothing. Look, the internet is the tool by which most of our economies are fueling. And I understand there are some legitimate concerns out there, but we also live in a world that we should recognize and more honestly deal with the fact you can spread an extraordinary amount of fear and misinformation on the internet. And the one thing I've challenged people to do is, why would we want to destroy the tool that's driving our economies? I mean, we have no reason to do that, and we have not attempted to do that in ACTA. We are not creating a new body. There's not going to be some super, sleuth-like body there on the internet. All ACTA does is say that those of us that have signed it are collectively going to work to combat piracy and counterfeit goods, which in a world in which more and more consumers are buying goods and services over the internet, protecting the public's health and safety and welfare is critical. And the sad reality, when counterfeit and pirated goods, particularly in the area of pharmaceuticals enter the marketplace, that's a real health and safety risk. And this just gives us collectively more tools to be able to combat that.
Well, on that pharmaceutical issue, moving on to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this time a 9-nation free trade agreement, but also that promotes this idea of protecting intellectual property, pharmaceutical patents and so on. There are critics, moving on to that side of things, who say that you will prevent poorer nations from having access to generic drugs as a result.
No, absolutely not. And one of the things we're proud of, the United States has absolutely been one of the major grounds for innovation in medicines and new life sciences and biotech and new technologies. But we've also been a leader in one of the stronger voices in understanding that the way that we protect intellectual property, and more critically, the way we bring these life-saving drugs to market has to be balanced with our collective social responsibility to make sure that poor nations have access to medicines. We've worked with other partners within the WTO to come up with the proper balance to do that. We see this Trans-Pacific Partnership as an opportunity for the 9 of us who will dominate trade, we think, in the Asia-Pacific, to have a way that not only promotes innovation, promotes research and development, but also makes sure that we have that proper balance to preserve access to medicines.
Critics of both those treaties, though, suggest that the trouble is that in the name of free trade, you are promoting, protecting, furthering American business interests at the expense, sometimes, of individual freedoms and even business opportunities in weaker nations.
Well, that gets a bit esoteric for me. I mean, my job, Melissa, is to look out for the interests, the export interests of American business, farmers, ranchers, and those that seek to sell goods, products, services that say made in America with the rest of the world. And we believe that we have helped change the quality of life. If we're talking about those people who live in least developed countries around the world by sharing our goods, our services, our technologies, and in the case of the poorest countries in the world, by opening up our markets to them on a non-reciprocal basis. But the United States wants to benefit from trade as much as we have allowed other countries to benefit from trade. And what we seek in any trade agreement is a fair balance that gives us the same opportunities now to go and compete for these consumers who are coming of age in new markets around the world, the way the United States has freely and willingly opened up our market over the last 50 years. We are the largest commercial market in the world, and we have helped lift millions of people out of poverty around the world by reducing our barriers and tariffs and giving them access to our market. We don't think it's too much to ask now to allow us to have the same opportunity to go into many of these emerging markets and have a chance to compete for their business.
Ambassador Von Kirk, thanks ever so much for having joined us on today's program. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Paris. Thanks
Melissa,
very much indeed.
I might. If I could add one thing, our website is ustr.gov. I would welcome any of your viewers to visit our website, see for themselves, and learn what we're trying to accomplish, not only with ACTA, but within the Trans-Pacific Partnership and our overall development and implementation of U.S. trade policy.
Very good. Ambassador, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Merci.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's interview. We'll, of course, be back very soon for another here on France 24. Do stay with us.